To study ancient history is to wrestle with missing evidence. We do not possess the autographs, the original physical documents penned by the authors themselves, for any major text of antiquity. Instead, we rely entirely on copies of copies. Consider Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. Our historical understanding of the Roman conquest of Gaul relies on at most 10 readable manuscripts, and the earliest of these dates a full 900 years after Caesar's life. The works of Homer fare slightly better in volume, but the temporal gap remains significant. Over half a millennium separates the composition of his epics from our earliest surviving fragments. Then there is the historian Tacitus. His writings are the foundation of our knowledge of first-century Rome, yet portions of his annals survive in a single manuscript copied 1,000 years after his death. Historians readily accept these classical texts as highly reliable records of the past. The gaps in time and the scarcity of manuscripts are considered standard hurdles, not deal-breakers. Yet when evaluating the biblical texts, academia often applies a different standard. If historical reliability is determined by the proximity of manuscripts to the events and the sheer volume of surviving copies, the New Testament data challenges the standard skeptical narrative. Modern critics often argue that the biblical text has been corrupted over time. They suggest that because scribes made handwritten copies of copies, the resulting documents are inherently untrustworthy. This argument relies on the concept of transmission decay, the idea that every successive copy introduces new errors that eventually mask the original message. Moving beyond this assumption requires testing the text across 3 independent lines of investigation: textual transmission, physical verification, and internal coherence. If the data from separate vectors converge, the decay model is shown to be insufficient to explain the evidence we actually possess. We begin with textual transmission. While classical authors like Thucydides survive in exactly 8 manuscripts, the New Testament is backed by over 5,400 distinct Greek manuscripts. Critics point out that across these thousands of manuscripts, there are roughly 400,000 textual variants, or differences. But that number is a statistical byproduct of the massive volume of data, not a sign of poor preservation. When a scribe makes a spelling error in an early manuscript, the mistake is copied, propagating into downstream texts. Because we have so many data points, critics cross-check the errors to isolate these patterns, identifying where a variant originated to determine the original reading. Once the spelling mistakes and grammatical shifts are filtered out, less than 1% of these variants affect the substantive meaning of the text. Core theological points remain untouched by these variations. Textual scholar Peter Williams notes that even modern electronic files experience minor corruption rates during duplication. That minor decay does not compromise the general integrity of the file, provided there is enough volume to cross-check. The vast number of biblical manuscripts is an asset. It provides the required data density to identify what the authors actually wrote with over 99% accuracy. The second line of investigation is physical verification. We test the text against the stratigraphic record, the layers of debris and architecture built up over centuries. For decades, a movement known as biblical minimalism argued that figures like King David were literary myths because no physical evidence of his reign existed. That consensus shifted dramatically in the year 1993. Archaeologists working in northern Israel uncovered the Tel Dan Stela. This monument was erected by an Aramean king, referencing his victories under the god Hadad. Incised into the stone is a clear Aramaic phrase, House of David. It stands as the first extra-biblical proof of the Davidic dynasty, etched by an enemy nation over a century after David's death. This physical anchoring extends to Jericho, specifically testing the account in Joshua chapter 6 against the city's physical profile. During her excavations in the 1950s, archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon documented a specific collapse in the fortification system surrounding the city Tel. Jericho's defenses consisted of an earthen embankment, a stone retaining wall, and a high mud brick wall. The archaeological record shows the mud brick structure failed, falling outward to form a physical ramp, creating a sloped entryway that aligns exactly with the biblical description. The excavation also revealed thick conflagration layers and stores of unharvested grain. Grain is a highly valuable commodity, normally looted by conquering armies, pointing to a rapid siege and subsequent burning, precisely as described. Moving to the 1st century, the Nazareth inscription provides early Roman documentation instituting the death penalty for tomb robbery, corroborating the political environment described in the New Testament. The physical record systematically anchors the biblical narrative to objective reality. The final vector is internal coherence, evaluated through the principle of embarrassment. This is an axiom used by historians, which states that any detail damaging to an author's reputation or cause is highly likely to be true. If the New Testament authors were fabricating a story to gain influence, they wrote themselves into the text as dim-witted, uncaring, and doubting cowards who abandoned their leader in his most critical moment. Fabricated religious texts prioritize the glorification of their founders and early leaders to validate their authority. The resurrection narratives rely on the testimony of women as primary discoverers of the empty tomb. In 1st century Judeo-Roman culture, a woman's testimony carried no legal weight. A fabricated story would have used admissible male witnesses as its foundation. The Gospels also display divergent coherence. Matthew mentions one angel at the tomb, while John mentions two. In a legal context, identical word-for-word testimony often points to collusion. Slight variations in detail indicate independent eyewitnesses describing the same event from different vantage points. The structural weaknesses, embarrassing admissions, and divergent details in the text point to authors committed to recording raw facts rather than engineering religious propaganda. We return to the accumulating evidence. The archaeological anchors, from the Tel Dan Stela to the collapsed walls of Jericho, lock into the physical verification axis. Finally, the internal historiographical markers populate the third axis. These three distinct lines of investigation converge on a singular conclusion. If a text is mathematically secure in its transmission, stratigraphically anchored in the dirt, and historiographically honest in its construction, the case for its historical reliability is robust. This foundation provides a concrete basis for the claim that the scripture cannot be broken. Trusting the biblical record does not require a withdrawal from reality. It is the result of following the historical evidence to its logical conclusion.